I'm Mark Horowitz from the music division, and on my left here is Ted Sperling, tonight's music director, pianist, conductor, and man of the hour. Ted's credits are sort of remarkable, and I just read them again in the program before, and I was overwhelmed at all the things you've done, and your Tony and your musicals and concerts. And this is the second time Ted and I have worked together. 10 years ago, we did a Marvin Hamlish concert here, and it was a memorable evening, and I know tonight will be one too. So thank you all for coming. So we haven't prepared too much, so Ted does not know what I'm going to ask him, and I'm not sure what he's going to ask me, but we'll do a Q&A at the end and stuff. But I do have some questions for him. My first is sort of, why did you say yes?
Well, we had a great time doing the Marvin Hamlish evening 10 years ago. Mark is a remarkable person. I don't know, you've probably come to other talks like this. He's such a depth of knowledge of this field. He's such a kind person and such a generous soul. So those are the kinds of people you want to work with, of course. And then to be drawing from a collection like this is a very unusual and special thing to be offered. We have a great library in New York, which is where I live. But we got a little tour today of this building, and wow. And yesterday, it was this morning, actually. It feels like yesterday already. I made a mistake in my schedule, and I thought Mark was offering to show a group of us some manuscripts across the street. So I just showed up at 9 o'clock, and then I realized no one else was there. And Mark was kind enough to give me my own private little peek. And I asked if I could look at some of Ella Fitzgerald's charts. And with a quick search on the computer and a dumbwaiter that brought them quickly up from somewhere, there they were, the handwritten pencil original scores from her classic recordings. So Nelson Riddle arrangements. So where else can you do that? And because it was early and we were alone in this big reading room, I said, "Is it okay if we listen to these while we watch, look through them?" So I just on my phone, I called up these recordings, and then to see what what we know from listening so many times, but to see it written out with the corrections and the musicians' markings was really something special. So thank you, Mark. And also, let's acknowledge that this whole program was Mark's idea, and that this was a giant research project, particularly for Mark, because there are so many songs to sift through for something like this, most of which have not been recorded. So to catalog them and just try to make some order out of it and say, these are the songs I think we should really look at. And so Mark did the lion's share of the prep for this to get us to this stage.
But you wouldn't... Well, but you wouldn't do the ill-tempered clavichord.
That's right. I put my foot down at one point. There's a song called The Ill-Tempered Clavichord, which, for those of us who studied piano as children, it's a riff on the well-tempered clavier or clavichord. And the idea behind this song is sort of a fun one, which is that this clavichord is very good at playing Bach, but then it gets exposed to boogie-woogie and decides that's what it really wants to play. So it sounds like a good idea, but when you actually try to sing the song, it turns out I don't know, my personal taste was this is not worth the stage time tonight when there's so many other things to do. And then by a very strange coincidence, one of our singers tonight, Jonathan, mentioned that he actually knew the ill-tempered clavichord already. Like, what are the chances? This is the one person in the world who has probably performed that song who is still alive. So I said, okay, let's give it a shot. So when we got together to rehearse, we sang through it, and I had the same opinion. So we're not singing it for you tonight. And I think it's okay. I think it's okay.
Maybe for the sequel.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the arrangements. We had brand new arrangements done just for tonight's concert. And one of the things that surprised me was when you said you wanted a harp. I think there are 6 musicians or 7.
7 if you include me.
I do. So out of all of those, why a harp?
The reason is that the harp does a few things really well that nobody else does. First of all, it's a surprisingly loud instrument, so you get a lot of bang for your buck. It can be an accompaniment instrument and replace the piano. And there's only one other instrument that can do that, which is guitar. And guitar didn't seem so appropriate for this material. But the harp can take over so that I don't have to play all the time. And so you'll see there are big stretches of tonight where I'll just be waving my hands. And I really enjoy that. Then the harp adds glamour like no other instrument, right? And it conjures up Europe to me, too. And there's so much about Loewe's music that feels continental, feels particularly Middle European. There's so many waltzes, there's so much Viennese influence that I thought, let's do the harp. And we were really lucky for this concert that we're collaborating with the Loewe Foundation, and the head of Loewe Foundation, Emily Altman, is here today. And some of my ideas for this arrangement process sprang from a conversation that Emily and I had where we discussed the idea of creating small-scale arrangements of some of the most famous songs. Because if you want to perform, I Could Have Danced All Night, say, in a concert, you can rent the original show orchestrations, which are for at least 25 players, can be scaled up if you want to add more strings. There are maybe even some other arrangements one could rent from the movie or from some concert library. But if you wanted to do it at a wedding, say, or at some smaller event, and you only wanted to hire 5 or 6 people or a string quartet, those arrangements would be very hard to find. So we thought maybe we could do double duty with tonight's concert and create some arrangements that can live on and be performed in other venues. So these arrangements are brand new. They're done by some of my favorite arrangers in New York. And they're somewhat flexible. You could leave the harp out, for example, and just have the piano play in those places, and you could still do the arrangements. But tonight you're getting the deluxe treatment. And our favorite harpist from New York came down, and we're playing a harp from the Marine Band, I think, that we borrowed for the occasion.
How did you select the musicians? Had you worked with all of them?
I worked with all these musicians in New York. They're all Broadway pit musicians. They also do other things, like our violinist was juggling a Baroque concert with our rehearsals this weekend. So she's a specialist in playing, music of the 1700s with a more antique style instrument and bow. And then we did a Broadway show together in the spring called Floyd Collins, where she had to play bluegrass. So these musicians, the people who play Broadway, are incredibly versatile. They can play in many different styles. So that's what I like to look for in musicians. So our violist is the violist for Maybe Happy Ending in New York. Our cellist is playing The Great Gatsby. Our bass player and I have been doing concerts together for 30 years. Same thing with the harpist. She reminded me today at dinner of the very first time we met, which I had forgotten. And she said she was impressed because it was for a revival of How to Succeed in Business, and I was fairly young. And she said it was the first time a conductor had ever walked around the room at the first rehearsal and then introduced himself to each musician. She said that had never happened in her experience before or since.
Do you still do it?
Yeah. Well, at this point, I actually will know 3/4 of them, and then I will have taken a flyer on a handful. So I just go straight to the ones I don't know and make sure we say hello.
So, and let's talk about casting of the singers.
Sure. Well, 3 of the singers tonight are people that I've worked with quite a few times. Brianna Marie is one of my favorite people to hire for concerts, and we've been doing a lot of symphony programs together, different style music, like we do one of Carole King, Carly Simon, and Joni Mitchell, and she's amazing. She can sing like Aretha Franklin. Then we do another program where she sings Summertime from Porgy and Bess in like the Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong arrangement, but then she interpolates some high Audra McDonald-like high notes. And so she's incredibly versatile. Scarlett Strallen and I have done a ton of concerts together. John Riddle and I'm not sure actually. Yes, John Riddle and I did a COVID era online concert together. That's how we met. And he recently came to audition for me for something else and made the room shake with his voice. And I ended up not casting him for that, but I made a mental note. It's like the next thing I can offer him, I want him. So here he is. And then the one person I've never worked with before is Jonathan Christopher, who I just saw play Judd Fry in Oklahoma at Carnegie Hall. And his brother, Nicholas, is somebody I have worked with. Nicholas is starring in Chess on Broadway right now. And I thought, well, if Jonathan is Nicholas's brother, it's probably a good chance he's wonderful too. So. And he was recommended by Jeff Berger, who is here tonight as well.
I shouldn't say this, but during rehearsals, I was blown away by all the singers. But I started crying when I heard John Riddle doing on the street. It was just
Unbelievable, right?
it was. So I'm envious of those of you who will experience for the first time. It is something. Were there any surprises as you were looking through the Loewe material, things you didn't expect or weren't aware of? Or
Well, of course, you found many, many songs I'd never heard of, let alone heard.
did it change your opinion of him or your appreciation?
You know, you clued me to some things about his upbringing and his musical training that I didn't know. For example, he studied with Ferruccio Busoni. And you may have heard of Busoni. He's most well known these days for his arrangements for piano of Bach, where he took these Baroque pieces and turned them into these virtuoso romantic showpieces for piano, sort of along the lines of Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt would do variations or rhapsodies based on opera themes. So Busoni's in that league. Busoni's known for this crazy piano concerto he wrote that's over an hour long. It has an invisible male chorus, has an impossible piano part. So this was Loewe's piano teacher when he was a child. And another of Busoni's influential students was Kurt Weill. So to realize that they were all together in Berlin and this was a little, incubator for genius, that surprised me. I didn't know that Loewe was a prodigy. I'm going to give away a couple of things that I'm going to mention tonight, so you're going to be in the know already. But he's the youngest soloist ever with the Berlin Philharmonic at age 13. So it's interesting that he didn't pursue a concert career as a pianist. When you're 13 and you're playing a concerto with the Berlin Philharmonic, I can imagine there's a lot of pressure to keep going in that direction, and he didn't. He came to New York because his father was a singer and got cast in a show in New York. And they came, and Frederick or Fritz just stayed. He didn't go back. And we'll tell you more later. I don't want to spoil all the surprises tonight.
But you said there were some things that you weren't going to have time to talk about.
Oh, there are many. But this I do mention in the concert, so I'm going to skip it for now.
So is there anything you do want to?
Sure, I'll tell you lots of stories. I grew up listening to My Fair Lady in particular. I later grew to appreciate Brigadoon and Camelot and Gigi, but My Fair Lady was it. I had very few LPs growing up, and some of you remember LPs, and of course they've made a comeback now. But I had only a handful of them, and My Fair Lady was one of 3 that just got constant play. And I remember really being intrigued by the cover, which was the Al Hirschfeld of God manipulating the leading characters as marionettes. And of course, in those days, you got to know the plots of shows by reading the back cover of the LP and looking at the little pictures. And you make this version in your head, which may be better than any version you'll ever see. So in some ways, it was a dream of mine to conduct My Fair Lady. And I finally got to do it just recently. We did a big revival in New York, and I was thrilled to be asked to be the music director. And that's how Emily and I met. It was a fun process to research it. So one of the main sources for stories about My Fair Lady is Alan J. Lerner's autobiography it's called The Street Where I Live. And it concentrates primarily on My Fair Lady and Camelot and Gigi. So that's full of fun stories that I would have loved to tell tonight in the concert, but I didn't want it to be an endless evening. So I'll give you just a couple about My Fair Lady, and then we can talk about other shows. So let's talk about On the Street Where You Live.
Okay.
So tonight we're going to do it because let me just give you a little bit of background about how we put this show together. Mark sifted through the hundreds of songs. Am I saying it right? Do you have 1,000 songs, you think of those? Hundreds. So many songs dating from the 20s through the 70s. Some of them incomplete, some of them just music, no words, sometimes words and melody but no accompaniment. So we had to decide which ones to include tonight. There was also some pressure that at least I put on myself to make this an evening about Loewe and not make it a standard Lerner and Loewe evening, because that's not the brief. The brief is that we're celebrating the Loewe collection and the Loewe manuscripts. So how to do that? Because the famous songs are Lerner and Loewe, right? And I want to give the audience some candy, right? You want to come and recognize some things, right? Don't you hate it when you go to see a favorite artist and they just do their latest album and you don't know any of the songs? That's so frustrating, right? So I had a few philosophies about how to do that. One is I wanted to do some things that were purely instrumental, so that the focus would be purely on the music and not on the words, because we so easily can focus on words. It takes a little bit of a different mindset to listen just to the music. So we're going to do an overture, for example, and I included songs in the overture that we're not going to sing later, so that you get a few more of the hit songs right up front. I also thought, let's throw a few hits near the top, right? Then we go into his very early years, and I thought that was important, because let's listen to Loewe before he met Lerner. And then once we do get to Lerner, around a third of the way or so into the program, let's do some of the songs we all know and love, but let's see if there's a twist here and there. So it's doesn't just at that point become a standard Lerner and Loewe program. So to that end, we do some cut material. For example, there's a big song for Henry Higgins that we're going to do that got cut. And it's a great song, but you can see why they cut it. That show ran famously like 4 hours long at its first performance. So I'll just tell you this story. So one of the big things that they figured out in previews, or in the tryout in New Haven, if you remember My Fair Lady, they're training her that whole first part of the show to make her appearance in society and persuade everybody that she's upper crust and that she speaks beautiful English. So he decides on a whim to take her to the Ascot races, right? And she's not ready. She knows how to pronounce things, but she doesn't know actually how to have a conversation. They forgot that part. And they didn't teach her how to behave in polite society. So she uses slang, she tells horrible stories about her father, and she finally ends the scene by yelling, "Move your bloomin' arse," right, in front of everybody. So she's humiliated, right? In the finished show, you fast forward after that, and you have Freddie come on and he sings On the Street Where You Live. That gives Eliza a time to get out of her Ascot costume, which is elaborate, right? It takes time to get out of that costume and into another one. And this song gives you time to do that. And then you fast forward, and the next thing you know, they're going to the ball. Well, in the original version, they did another 20 or so minutes of actually training Eliza to be ready for the ball. So there was a big ballet where you see her getting dance lessons and learning how to hold a teacup and all these other things that are going to make her fit for society. And then she then at the last minute, she gets cold feet and she won't leave her room. And so this song comes there, and it's a song called Come to the Ball. And it's Rex sort of singing through the closed door at Eliza and trying to coax her out of the room the way he did earlier with like offering her chocolates. He keeps painting a picture of why it's going to be fun and how she owes it to people to go. And then she had a song called Say a Prayer for Me Tonight, which was her actually getting the courage to open the door. Both of those songs got cut, so you just fast forward, and there she is at the top of the staircase in her ball gown, and you go to the ball. And don't forget, in the original, the ball is the end of the first act, so you still have a long ways to go before intermission, because that ball is not short. So you can see why they just fast forwarded. But tonight you'll hear Come to the Ball. The other thing in that little section of the show is On the Street Where You Live, which apparently was laying an egg when they were performing it in New Haven. No one seemed to like the song, and they were considering cutting it. Loewe did not want to cut it. I think he loved the music, but Moss Hart and Lerner were sort of advocating for getting rid of it. And then they realized maybe one of the problems was people didn't know who Freddie was. Right? Is that your memory, Emily, of the story? That Freddie appears at the very top of the show. He knocks Eliza over at Covent Garden, but it's very quick, and it's in the first minute of the show, so it's easy to forget him. Then he shows up at Ascot, and he laughs a little bit. He's amused by her. But apparently people sort of forgot who he was by the time he sang On the Street Where You Live. And so they weren't really invested or paying attention to him, and it seemed like a long song to give a character they didn't even know. So we're going to do the original version of that song for you tonight, which I happen to like a lot. But they rewrote it so that the beginning of it literally tells you everything that happened in Ascot again, in case you forgot it in the last 10 minutes. Like when she bit off the spoon, and when she talked about move your blue arse. He literally reruns that scene for you, so you, oh, it's that guy. And that seemed to make the difference. I think those are my Fair Lady stories.
You just reminded me of something I'd forgotten about. Yeah. And a few years ago, I met Julie Andrews here at the library, and I was in awe and stuff. But at one point, we were just, I think, as we were walking out, we were chatting as she was waiting for the limo to pick her up. And I forget even what made her what brought it up, but we talked about My Fair Lady, and she said, you know, the thing I learned was I was on the wrong side of the footlights. We'd been through a hellish 8 weeks of rehearsals that were just, you know, it was really a hard, difficult show for her. And she said, and we opened, and Fritz, Allen, and Moss all went off on an ocean liner, and I was stuck doing 8 shows a week for her after. So
she's learned her lesson. She's been directing recently.
Exactly.
Well, I had a nice experience. When we were rehearsing My Fair Lady at Lincoln Center Theater, I got an email, I think, from Jerry Adler, who you might know as an actor on The Sopranos and what was the other? He's on 2 big series on TV, playing sort of like the crusty old Jewish lawyer. But it turns out he was assistant stage manager on the original production of My Fair Lady. His dad was the production manager at the Mark Hellinger Theater, and he got his son a job on My Fair Lady. And Jerry wrote to me and said, would it be okay if I visited rehearsal? So I said, of course. Somebody directly involved in the original production. So he came to rehearsal, and he handed me a CD. And he said, this is a recording I made of the original production of My Fair Lady a week after we opened or something like that. And I just had it digitized, and here you go. So it's the whole show. And it's from some microphone that he rigged to the stage and ran like a cord down to the basement or something. I don't know how he did this, whether it was surreptitious or not. It's a very good recording. And it's of the whole show. You get to hear Julie Andrews delivering all the lines, which we've never heard her do. And it was a revelation to me. First of all, I was full of questions, like little tiny questions about, did the bassoon actually play this, or blah, blah, blah. So here was an actual recording that I could refer to of stuff that's never been on the albums and stuff like that. So I could say, oh, look, the bassoon is actually playing or not. But the big revelation for me was how fast and how funny the show was. It was directed by Moss Hart, who was a specialist in comedy. You know, he wrote The Man That Came to Dinner and You Can't Take It With You. He directed it like a bat out of hell, and she and Julie Andrews was really funny in it. And so the whole show, with no cuts at all, because of course that's the original, was 2.5 hours, and we did our version with lots of cuts, and we were 3 1/4. It's like, well, there's the difference. They just took it a hell of a lot faster. Not that the songs were faster, but the scenes were really fast, and they were played like a drawing room comedy, really, like bang, bang, bang. So it was really fun to hear. And then there are a couple of stories about Camelot I thought people might be interested in that I don't go fully into. So My Fair Lady, of course, was the biggest success since Oklahoma, or maybe Guys and Dolls, but it was like pinnacle of success, considered the perfect show, set all these new records. So there was a lot of pressure on Camelot, which was the next show. It had Julie Andrews in it again. It was the same writers, the same director. So everybody, the advance sale was tremendous. They made a mistake in saying yes to trying out in Toronto. The traditional tryout houses back then were Boston, New Haven, and Philadelphia. But they were building a brand new theater in Toronto, and they offered the show a very good deal if they would be the first tenant in this brand new theater, the O'Keefe Center. Has anybody here been to the O'Keefe Center? It's built in the 60s. No, it built in the 50s. So it's not a traditional old-fashioned theater like all these others. And it's very long. It has this sort of long, swooping quality. So the stage can feel very far away. And if you've ever worked in show business, and you should know, you don't open a brand new theater with a precious show of yours, because there are all sorts of kinks to be worked out in a new building, and especially sound. Acoustics are a mystery. There are all these people who consult on building theaters and concert halls, and I guess they've learned a lot over the years, but you never really know what something's going to sound like until you try it. And apparently the sound was a disaster in this building, and they'd struggled so hard just to tame the building. Then on top of it, Loewe was recovering from some serious illness. I forget what, now I'm not remembering what. And in the midst of rehearsals, Lerner got a terrible ulcer and had to be hospitalized for several weeks. So he couldn't go to rehearsals. And then when he was finally released, he was leaving the hospital. He saw a stretcher coming in, and it was Moss Hart on the stretcher who had just had a heart attack. They literally moved Moss into Lerner's room. So Lerner was back, but there was now no director. And the show was 4 hours long. And what were they going to do? So they initially thought, well, let's find a new director or a sub-director who can get us through this. But they couldn't agree on who that would be. And Moss finally got a message to Lerner and said, you should just do it until I can come back. And Loewe was not happy. And I have seen this in my experience. The balance between the writers can be a delicate one. And when suddenly one is also the director, then the other one feels very diminished. Hold on one second. It's hard to remain objective. And one of the roles of the director is to try to be objective. It's hard because you know the material so well, but at least you can talk to the writers and say, I think we need a new song here or something like that. And you can be a somewhat impartial third party. When you're also one of the writers, that's gone. And that seems to have caused a big problem between the two men. And in this book, Lerner says it was never the same after that. And then they finally got to New York and opened to sort of mixed reviews, but still had a lot of tickets sold because of all the advance. So they were doing well, but they weren't satisfied that they'd actually solved all their problems. Moss finally got out of the hospital, was back at work, came to see the show, and he said, let's get back into rehearsal, which was highly, highly unusual. Once a show opens, it's usually set. But here, they went back into rehearsal maybe 6 weeks or so after opening. They made a lot of cuts. So there are songs on the cast album, which were made in the interim, that are not in the finished show, like Phi on Goodness, I think is not in the show. And they made a lot of cuts, so the show was tighter and better. And then were offered a spot on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they did 4 or 5 songs from the show complete with staging and costumes and everything on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that seems to have turned the fortunes of that show around, and they became a big hit. The other funny story about Camelot that I read is that they were looking for a Lancelot, and they didn't have someone in mind particularly, and this guy walked in who they thought was Canadian, and he had the name Robert Goulet, so they thought he was French-Canadian, and they were looking for somebody to play a French knight, you know, and he sang and looked amazing, so they cast him on the spot, and then it turns out he was American. He was just on his way to Canada to do some job or something, and he didn't speak any French and had no French background in his family at all, but didn't seem to matter.
Oh, it just occurred to me, you worked on Something in the Park with George, which was the director was also the
That's right.
scriptwriter, but that's where the exception to the rule.
Well, yeah, so my very first Broadway show as a regular part of the production was Sunday in the Park with George in 1984. And James Lapine was both the book writer and the director of that show. And I do remember we had a very troubled preview process for that show. We were missing some key songs. People loved the first act mostly, but then they were literally leaving the theater in the middle of the second act. I have not seen that in my more recent, like the idea of actually getting up in the middle of a show and just leaving in the middle of an act, that would not, that would be a very rare occurrence for me, but apparently half the audience was doing that during our second act. My parents were mortified and very worried for me. It's like my first job, and they needed the show to be a success, and they wrote a letter to the Schubert organization saying, "You've got to do something about the second act," and they didn't consult me before sending it. But I do remember like the buzz, in the company was like, should James get somebody else in, or did he have the perspective to fix this as one of the authors? We postponed the opening twice, I think. And then finally, these 2 songs came in at the very last minute, which were the center of Act 2. And at least they tied it together, so it made more sense to people. And that made the difference. And then we did get some very good reviews, particularly from the Times and the Pulitzer, and that show, ended up being very beloved. But it was definitely not everybody's cup of tea when we started.
I think we should open up to the audience. Are there questions?
Yeah, microphone. Let me go this.
They're bringing you a mic.
Oh, sure. I'm wondering if you can talk about, in My Fair Lady, the Henry Higgins. Everybody has this image that he's much older, and I think that's because of the movie. And I'm just wondering sort of how that's affected the show, before that, after that.
Right. Good question. I think the part was originally conceived for Noel Coward to play. I think they went through a few people before it was Rex Harrison. But then it was clearly, once it was Rex, it was going to be Rex's show. Like, he was the star. So it was written to suit him. And as you mentioned, he was nearly 10 years older by the time they made the movie. So if you watch younger Rex Harrison in some of his earlier movies, that's probably a better idea of what he was like in My Fair Lady. And I find him very charming and attractive. There is an element in the script there where he describes himself as being a confirmed bachelor. He's done with women, no interest in getting married. So that gives you the sense that he's been through the mill and that he's come out the other side. When we did our production, we deliberately cast somebody on the younger end of the spectrum and made him a little bit more, like a little on the spectrum maybe, and that's that he's monomaniacal and somewhat cut off emotionally. So one of the difficulties with My Fair Lady is the last scene, because you've done the scene where she says goodbye to him, she sings Without You, and she says, I'm done, basically. And then he sings I've Grown Accustomed to Her Face, so you see a big turnaround for him. And he admits to himself in his own little way that he's in love with her or that he misses her. And then she shows up in the study and with no explanation just says She echoes what she said in the first scene. I wash my hands and face before I come. I did. And then he says, Eliza, where the devil are my slippers? And that's the end of the show. And you can do the version was done on Broadway originally and done in the movie, where he puts his hat down and sort of slumps in his chair, and you feel like it's a bit of, it's a joke that they're both in on. And in our production, Bart wanted to try something different. So he had a very long silence. We had quite a few of those in our show, which helped make it so long. But he basically said it in our production, like not knowing what else to say. And then she waited for him to say something better. Something like, welcome home, or I missed you. It doesn't have to be, I love you and I want to marry you, but just some acknowledgement that would make her feel okay about having come back. And so in our production, she looked at him and put her hand on his face and waited, and he didn't say anything. He was just paralyzed. And then she left. She walked up through the audience out into her future, which to some people was a very appropriate modern ending for the show. For other people, it was mystifying. It was particularly difficult when we toured the production, and there were no steps for her to walk up. So she just walked into the wings, and I didn't think that worked nearly as well. But anyway, before we even did our production, I had this idea that if you could find a young Higgins who was just so into himself and so caught up in theory that could work well too. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. You were first, and then.
Oh, I want to throw this. I don't think it's going to be a curveball because you know everything. But you mentioned that one of the songs that was cut from My Fair Lady was Say a Prayer for Me.
Yeah.
I heard it in the show in which it was placed.
Yes.
Which was Gigi.
Yeah.
And I thought then, not that I'm putting a halo on my head, this is all wrong.
Oh, really?
Because a French girl would never sing Let Me Be Wellington and not Bonaparte. And I thought, that's very odd. Why is this here? And then I heard later that it was something that Eliza Doolittle quite properly would sing as a patriotic English woman. Of course, she would want to be Wellington. So do you know anything about that and how they shoehorned that into Gigi and didn't say, well, this doesn't quite work?
I don't really know anything more than you do about that, except that it was a song they liked, they had cut it, they needed something for the movie, and I think sometimes people take the easy route. I'm surprised about some of the things that we discovered in My Fair Lady that are improper if you're really British. We had real British people in our show. Our Higgins was from London. And there are certain things that look like they rhyme on the page, but if you're actually speaking in a proper British accent, they do not rhyme. One example is en masse is not en masse. And in the song, it's supposed to rhyme somehow. It's something like that. And our Higgins just refused to say it wrong. He's like, no, I'm British and I'm going to say it the right way. But there were other things like, don't talk of spring, don't talk of fall, don't talk at all, show me. The British don't say fall, they say autumn. And when they took the show to England back in 1958 or whatever, they rewrote that lyric because the audience was not going to accept it. But I was surprised because Lerner lived in England for a while. Julie Andrews was British. Rex Harrison was British. Holloway was British. Everybody was all the principals were actually British. And why did nobody say anything in rehearsal? They were all having tea every day at 4 o'clock. Why didn't anybody bring this up? I was sort of shocked. So I think sometimes things slip through the cracks. Yeah.
The other lyric is "Snap me and mail me." They don't say mail in England, so they changed that one too. But another My Fair Lady question: I know some of this story, but not all of it. Maybe you can clear it up. I think I Could Have Danced All Night was originally I Want to Dance All Night.
Huh.
And in fact, if you get some of the pressings of the original cast album, it says that on the back.
Fun.
And I think it was in another place. And I think maybe she was referring to the ball. But do you? It sounds like maybe you don't know that
Well,
full story.
what we've found in our research is that, according to Lerner in his book, so you either decide to take him at his word or not, they really struggled to find I Could Have Danced All Night. And according to Lerner, they wrote 6 songs first and ultimately rejected them. And we're going to do one of them for you tonight that we have 2 versions of. Again, I'm not going to go into this level of detail tonight, but we had found 2 autograph versions of this song called Shy. And one is sort of a lilting ballad, boom, chunk, that kind of rhythm. And then the second version is which is how I Could Have Danced All Night is played. Same melody, 2 different approaches. So we're going to do both tonight. We're going to start it one way, transition to the other. But all the songs that we've looked at, and I remember we did a program for the BBC about My Fair Lady in particular, right, with Christine Andreas, and we sang through some of these songs. So I'm a little surprised we couldn't find
I
any.
don't think it's true because we have, in fact, I think it's on display in the lobby there, Loewe's manuscript for I Could Have Danced All Night as I Could Have Danced All Night, whereas his manuscript for On the Street Where You Live has the earlier version title On the Street Where She Lives. So
Well, then maybe it's just a mistake on the album.
Maybe.
Some of them do say, I want to dance.
But all these earlier songs that they wrote for this spot were all romantic. And they were all about some version of why can't we admit we're in love, or why I want to hold him again, or it was so great to be in his arms, because they danced the tango together. It's their first physical contact in The Rain in Spain. And so when she's saying I could have danced all night, she's not talking about the ball, at least not in the finished version. She's talking about the tango in The Rain in Spain. She was so happy to be having fun with Higgins finally, and to feel a little spark between them, whether he felt it or not. So you'll hear this Shy song is very much about why can't we express our love to each other, and that was clearly wrong. But I'm so impressed by them that they kept at it, you know, and if they really did write 6 songs before they found I Could Have Danced All Night, hats off to them.
So I'm the one holding the mic. So
Okay, you get to ask the question then.
It's my turn. I was very impressed by the ending you talked about for your version of My Fair Lady, where she leaves, and I wonder if it's common knowledge that that it's based on Shaw's Pygmalion. And
Right.
in college, I was really shocked when I read it to find that she goes with Freddie,
Right.
and that sort of kind of actually made sense to me at the time. So did you know that?
Sure. Well, everybody had to read Pygmalion again before we did the show, and we had to watch the movie of Pygmalion, and of course we read about the history of how My Fair Lady happened as a musical, and it's very much due to the man who made the movie of Pygmalion and changed the ending against Shaw's wishes. But Shaw had died by the time they made the musical, and so he no longer could object to this more romantic ending. Yeah. And the guy who made the movie, I think, held the rights to the play at that point. I did want to tell you one other thing, because I have a captive audience tonight, and I'm just so taken with this. The very first song we're going to sing on the program is the earliest song that we're doing from Loewe's output. It's from 1923, written while he was still living in Berlin, so it's in German. And I will talk a little bit about the German tonight, but just this much. But I just want to give you guys a little bit more of the lyric so that you understand what I'm singing about, because I'm going to do the German, because I didn't want to make any of the singers have to learn German for tonight. It's a hilarious song to me. It's called Catherine, or Katrin, and I think it could only have been written in 1923 because it's a shimmy. Emily knows it. So first of all, it says shimmy underneath the title. It's like, I think we all have an idea what a shimmy is, right? It's like you shake, right? But why? And so what you might not know is that the shimmy was considered the most scandalous of all the dance crazes from the 20s. And it was in fact banned in some places. It was too suggestive and it was too frenetic. And it was inspired by the dresses that flappers wore, which had a lot of fringe. because when you shimmy with fringe, it's fun to watch, right? There's a lot going on. The fringe is going all directions. But the other thing about flappers in the early 1920s is it was the first time women were showing bare or stockinged legs. Before then, skirts always came at least to the ankle. And now they crept up so you could see the calves. This song is all about a woman's calves. It's very specific. It says the word calf over and over. It compares the calves to a chicken leg, and it literally it says chickenbeine. In English, it uses the word chicken, and it's a compliment because it's shapely. And the song is about how she has the finest legs in all Berlin. And there's some other just hilarious things to me. It compares her to a Mercedes-Benz, but you have to be listening very carefully because they just say Benz, and everybody's supposed to know what that means. It also uses a phrase I didn't know in German called Donnerwetter, which you can literally translate if you read it. It's like thunder weather, right? It means a thunderstorm. But in colloquial German, it means wow, basically, or geez Louise. And it's used several times in this song. Anyway, I just think it's a hilarious lyric. And I wish I could translate all of it for you in real time, but now you have a little insight. When I say Donnerwetter, you'll know what I'm talking about.
You told her what the X's and O's and
Well, I do. There's one more bit that I will tell you later.
yes.
Yes, my parents bought me tickets to My Fair Lady when I was 12 or 13, little girl from Brooklyn. And I went, and after that I bought the album and a record player, and I learned all the words. And I can understand why a Broadway audience, or people from Manhattan, let me put it that way, would have liked it. But why do you think it has this appeal to people for whom this means absolutely nothing? This little girl from Brooklyn.
Really good question. I'd be curious to know what you all think. Well, I think even though it's theoretically was conceived as Rex Harrison's show, I think from my point of view, we all sympathize with Eliza, and we're following her journey. She's the person who changes. She's the person who has an I wish. She has an I wish song, Wouldn't It Be Loverly? And she's downtrodden and is trying to make something better out of her life.
It's a Cinderella story.
Yeah, so I think that's very appealing. That's something very emotional we can all key into. I think it's a funny show and romantic. And I think the original production was also, and you can tell us, beautiful to see, right? The design was striking. The movie's even more opulent, designed by the same designer. I was a little boy when the movie came out, and I had already seen Mary Poppins and fallen head over heels in love with Julie Andrews, or Mary Poppins. I couldn't tell the difference. And I devoted all my free time to drawing pictures of Mary Poppins, and my mom saved them all. So I now am the proud owner of like 500 crayon drawings, watercolors, everything. Close-up studies of the parrot head umbrella and of her feet, like this. And, so when the Sound of Music came out, I was like mad for that movie. And then My Fair Lady is the same era. It's all like mid-60s. So my grandmother knew I was a big Julie Andrews fan, and so she took me to see My Fair Lady in the movie theater in the Bronx. And I sat down so excited, and then if you remember the way this movie starts, it starts at the flower market, and over the overture there are all these close-ups of peonies and pansies and everything. And then people start talking, and I couldn't understand a word because it's all the strong Cockney, right? And I was totally lost. And I turned to my granddaughter and I said, "This is for grown-ups." And we left. And we walked down the block, and I saw a marquee, and I said, "I want to see that." And it was the Yellow Submarine, which had also just come out. And it looked like a cartoon, so of course I thought that was going to be for kids. We walked in, and do you think I understood a word of that movie? think about the accents in that. So, but we stayed. I think I liked the purple people eaters or something in there. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think some of these these shows that have lived on, they deal with something very true to humanity and to something we can latch onto. And I wonder sometimes about new shows, like, are these going to endure in the same way? And then I just saw Oklahoma recently. They did a concert version of it in New York. And I thought, I'm not sure this works anymore. Having seen, there was this very strange production in New York a few years back where they deconstructed it and made it incredibly dark. And I left that one thinking, well, I don't know if anybody can ever do Oklahoma again. But so I was willing to see it in its original form. It's like, well, now I understand why they did something weird with it. Yeah. Do you want to take any other questions?
I think we have time for, oh, no, we're out of time.
Okay.
You all
Our producer is pulling.
enjoy the concert. Thank
Okay.
you.